Welcome, my darling ghouls, and thank you for joining me on this inaugural episode of LadyAxe Presents. I hope you like it. It's about 50 minutes long, nice and slow burner. Don't expect any jump scares or anything. It's all about the ocean and its unpredictability, and also very much about timing when and where you swim. It's a little ditty I call Bait. And remember, never trust who you swim with.
Haley's hair whipped under the sweep of the wind as she stepped onto the tarmac. It punished the tender soles of her feet with its sharp, black, jagged teeth, still infused with the blistering temperature of summer sun. It was her final day on the working holiday in this exotic land of grass skirts and warm evenings and bobbing fishing boats. For the entire week she had had to endure meetings with Agatha, running errands for Agatha, pet-sitting for Agatha, leaving her no room for her own indulgences. With all her seemingly minuscule tasks, every day of the week seeped into the next, until it became nothing more than a molten mess of corporate gut-wrenching slobberage of groveling and ass-kissing to the executives of Marmon & Lake Associates. Agatha insisted that Haley accompany her, masking the personal assistant's professional slavery as a well-deserved venture out of the office. Haley scoffed at the insolence of her superior for imagining that she was foolish enough to believe such drivel. Still, now that she had fulfilled all the bullet-point chores on Agatha's list, she was going to enjoy her last day on the obscure island to the delight of her insubordinate cravings, with not a thought for protocol or business propriety. The ocean beckoned before her, inviting her to cool down those burning feet in the lure of its azure solace. With the allure of the southern seas, the late afternoon possessed Haley's senses with the odor of early dinner fires and delectable cuisine emanating from the eastern side of the docks. Even to the regular tourist, this was a strange land. Customs and rituals aside, she found that there was an odd malevolence about the earth here. More than most isolated islands, locals did not like outsiders, and only tolerated tourists for the meager economical relief they provided. According to the islanders, occasional intruders brought a measure of welfare, aiding in sustenance where other intruders just like them had exploited them already. Haley felt correctly that this was the only reason they were tolerated, in some turnstile to undo the dun of other corporate sharks. Perhaps it was the alien nature of the island that imposed such a feeling of threat in her. But she had to do this one last thing before the flight back tomorrow, if only to prove to herself that she was not completely at the beck and call of Agatha Spears of Upper Manhattan, that she had to indulge in the secret freedom of a dip in the ocean. As she made her way to the beach on light feet with girly yelps of discomfort, Haley took little notice of the gazes from brown-skinned locals, leering at the out-of-place white meat. Overhead, the yellow wrath of the sun did the same, scorching the unwanted tourist fleeing towards the soothing blue. To Haley's surprise, the water was tepid. She had been fooled many times before by the true temperature of beaches in the height of summer, finding the water utterly frigid. However, this time the ocean warmed to the sky as it did in hue, appeasing the pale young professional to comfort. Like a child, Haley basked in her rare liberty and splashed about in the breakers. With timeless speed, the day grew smaller in the eye of the heavens, and soon it withered into the genesis of the coming evening. However, oddly enough, the temperature persisted, presenting no mercy under the guile of the late hour. Haley was a compulsive fumbler, always have been. But this day she had good reason. Her meager swimsuit rode up between her buttocks with every stride, with every paddle and kick. Annoyingly, it would settle itself snugly in the crevice of her plump ass, forcing the poor young executive to readjust. "Oh, for crying out loud!" she sighed, as she noticed how the time had passed. "I hope Agatha is still napping. If she finds out that I came out without her goddamn permission, I will never hear the end of it." It was time for Haley to get dry and get dressed, in time to return to the hotel before her boss realized that she had absconded. When she emerged from the sea, the beach fires looked brighter, perhaps only for the darkening afternoon. Vexed, she had to lift the oversized t-shirt she covered her bathing suit with, and unceremoniously stick the tips of her fingers into the elastic to release the hem. It looked rather unsightly, a pretty young woman walking with her hands up her crack, with every leap over the still blistering parking lot tar. She stood out amongst the rugged, swarthy fishermen and village women, with her feathery blonde tresses and her well-groomed, pale body. Onlookers made no secret that they found her quite the spectacle, either for the admiration of the younger men or the envy of the women. Hardly over the first patch of the tar panel, Haley stopped dead in her tracks. She had to abort her hasty move toward the rental car when she saw Agatha on her way to the beach in the company of a colleague. The obnoxious director's overweight curvature tested the overpriced dress she was wearing, while she drowned in her own chatter. Shit, Haley grunted on scorching soles, turning on her heel to rush back to the water. "Doubt you will see me in the sea, you old bitch. 2 proper glasses of wine and you'll be too drunk to see me slip by anyway." Upon returning to the slowly evacuated waves, she noticed most swimmers and surfers had started making their way out to join the fire parties on the beach. Not surprisingly, she was once more the salmon in the stream, garnering way too much attention. Haley attempted not to take note of their prying eyes, but it was an unmistakable awkwardness that hounded her all the way to the water's foamy edge. Finally reaching the refuge of water, the ocean breathed a cool sigh onto her warm skin. At once it provoked her skin to crawl, with prickly hair and hardened nipples peeked inside her bathing suit. "So glad I'm wearing this t-shirt. They have enough to look at as it is," she thought as she ambled, hoping that Agatha would be tardy. Again she fumbled, pulling the shirt away from her peeking breasts under the glare of the last surfers, who bobbed slowly on their boards in the rise and fall of the waves ahead of her. Haley took care not to make eye contact with them, but she could hear their indecipherable bantering on what was certainly a rousing appraisal of her figure and her presence there. For a moment she raised her eyes to one of them, perched on a surfboard like a native chief. He was an unattractive specimen with a blubbery brown torso. She saw that his neck was adorned with a collection of ivory molars and incisors on a dirty string of twine that slapped against his chest every time he leaned backwards from his rocky motion. They all did this, curiously. They would lean forward and glance deep into the water as if mesmerized, peering long and intently into the water beneath. Then they'd slowly pull back their faces from the water and lean back. Around the chief's right hand, Haley saw a piece of rough blue fabric wrapped, while within his palm it held fast a disturbing-looking object. Haley scowled, and it was not for the sharp glare of the slow-dying sun. The thing fixed to the surfer's hand reminded her of a grater. Upon scrutiny, she found the detail. It was a flat plate of bone with protrusions among it like prongs. The latter was held downward, as if to hide it from plain sight. "A hand fang," she muttered, giving it a name. He watched her watch him, giving her a cold stare that compelled her to turn her eyes away once more. Haley started into the infant waves, the first kiss of the pristine salt water taking her breath for a moment, and she moaned inadvertently. The group of men on their plain surfboards laughed out loud and mumbled something she was certain was some manner of insult, before continuing their odd practice of leaning. All of them had similar hand fangs that they held palms down, and she darted her eyes from one to the other, as not to betray her examination of them. They all ascended in unison, mounting a wave that was birthed seemingly from nowhere. It rolled with an angry hiss toward her, lurching over her with malice. Haley dreaded the impact of the crashing curve that denied her escape. Casually, it simply fell hard on her, sweeping her off her feet in the shallow water, swallowing her lower body entirely, raising the mark of her new wetness. Swamped with embarrassment, Haley submerged herself completely beneath the surface to get the cold shock over and done with, and swam deeper into the beauteous blue turmoil. Under the surface, it afforded her a moment's peace. She still panted wildly as she surfaced again, her breath challenged by the unpleasant baptism dealt her at the will of the ocean's frigidity, much like that of the band of cruel onlookers that rose and fell with the rippling swells. However, they gazed past her this time, their tongues mute and their eyes fixed on something behind her in the shallow water. A ruckus ensued behind her in the water, boisterous laughter that floated on the warm air in unfamiliar dialects among savage splashing. Voices, male voices. Haley cringed at the sound of them, and on second thought elected to rather suffer Agatha's wailing. She decided to get out of the water. Regardless of the number of men's voices she heard close to her, they sounded drunk and crude, and she shivered as they approached from behind, barring her from the rescue of the beach and its people. Agatha did not know that she was here, for once a bad churn in Haley's stomach. All she had hoped for was to have 1 hour's enjoyment after the dreaded week. But here she was trapped between two factions of unfriendly testosterone, caught in a terrain where she did not belong, and the thought appalled and terrified her. The group of surfers had now drifted farther into the bosom of the immediate sea, behind the waves where the depths lay quietly underneath them. Still, they watched. Haley pretended not to take notice of the loud men behind her, and now swam to her right, attempting to flee their impending company, by veiling her escape as leisurely paddling. Enfolded in the unabating cold of the sea, she made her way through the mild currents as far as she could, keeping her eye on the horizon in front of her, where the sun finally threatened to drown. From the west rose a majestic squall upon the blue, sweeping the saline tears of the ocean plain along the surface, weeping the droplets onto all who faced it. Haley watched in bewilderment as the tooth-bearing surfers called out their warnings to one another. Shortly after, they made haste for the beach, but the inebriated group of ingrates behind her followed in her slipstream, ignoring whatever had chased off the locals. "Hey, baby!" shouted one of the creeps. She winced. "Hola, mama," came another. Relentlessly, the taunts came one after the other. Haley ignored them, but her body grew anxious from the awful possibilities of their intentions. Briefly, she turned to face them, securing her entire body below the waves to deny them any reason. Still, the freezing water held her, and somewhere among the vigilance and anxiety of her position, her brain riddled the explanation for it. These were tropical waters, and even if they were not, surely her body would have gotten used to the cold by now, yet the temperate conformity of this region escaped her. The blonde Londoner looked swiftly at her stalkers. They were 7 in number, and all looked relatively similar, from the same ethnicity perhaps. Reminiscent of some psychotic football team, they swam with her, surrounding her with their dark brown eyes lapping at her pretty face like dogs in high arousal, drunk with lust and filled with ill intention.
Keep your cool, her thoughts lectured her. Just like in the movies, the longer you keep from panicking, the longer they have to keep from attacking. You know, like the demons only attack once the priest walks in. Don't let the priest walk in, Haley. Don't let them know.
Two of them had long hair, framing their faces savagely. Their mouths agape with exertion, they grinned at the exotic little stranger who kept treading water, although the sandy floor was well within reach of her tread. She was astonished at the blackness of their eyes, as if there was only darkness on the other side. One by one the waves came, wringing her shirt around her like the sails of a sinking vessel, and threatening to drag her under. But she had more pressing concerns for her safety. Some of the wicked drunkards drifted a bit further, but they maintained their distance, floating ominously about her like marine vultures. There was only one thing to do. They would never let her swim through their circle without incident. Against her better judgment, and desperate, Haley gathered the courage to speak to them. "Hi," she said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Hey," one of the long-haired ones rasped, his lascivious answer like the contact point of a lightning rod on her soul. Some of the others barked suggestive words at her in their strange tongue, but the one she had addressed hushed them all with one word. Clearly he was the alpha. "You come from," he said again in broken English. Haley almost felt a sense of relief had he not drifted so uncomfortably close to her now. I come from England," forcing a smile, and the group howled at her reply. "England, Mama!" One of the farther floaters exclaimed. "White meat!" he roared, while the others laughed heartily. She felt her stomach turn. In the commotion, she was unable to hear one of them swim right up to her until his giant hand brushed suddenly across her right thigh. Haley screamed and kicked, horrified at the breach of respect and the sudden sight of him right next to her. The group of men burst out in a roar of laughter, like defiant devils, without a concern for her fright. In fact, they seemed to feed on it. From deep inside her chest, a hissing ensued, growing as her panic ascended to her throat, but she kept it as far hidden as possible. Her eyes combed the directions out ahead of her in hopes of finding a route to escape. To poor Haley's dismay, she found that the eastern side of her path was marred by a large peninsula of blackened rocks. They protruded from the rising waters like a coal mountain, dressed in horns and riddled with gaping razors of stone. Her eyes were therefore compelled to examine other directions, but all it offered was more trouble. From a distance emerged a strange tidal wave, rapidly approaching them all. The wary Haley knew not whether to fear the gathering circle of brutes more than the unnatural burst of a storm that swept across the ocean and raced maniacally towards them. All present took urgent notice of it, though. Their eyes fell on the rising waters that moved like an avalanche at them. A low rumble came from the belly of the waters, first as a breath, and then escalating to the voice of Tiamat herself. They were forced to turn and confront the rumbling wall of water that rolled across the distance like a liquid juggernaut, ripping through fishing trawlers which came in its path, as if they were matchboxes. Alarmed, they looked about them, and, realizing that they were too far in to make for the sand, they hastily cast their suggestions and cried to their leader for advice. Haley did not understand a single word, but fear is a universal emotion, and she was all too familiar with its face, the face she now saw before her. Her own terror was diminished by the hope of her captor's looming obliteration. some of the men started swimming madly, attempting to outrun the wrath of the mighty gust that defied science and nature alike. But the wild currents that came with the rolling foam held them in place, fixed. Impotent and unable to make any progress for all their toil, they remained in place. Another lingered, eyes cast to the sky, babbling incoherently in his moment of need. The man she had spoken with simply watched in awe and glanced back at Haley for a brief moment. "You know what is," he said, sober in shock. "No." She shook her head and bit her lip, her eyes wider than before, and her mouth a hue of lilac, courtesy of the cold. "Maybe we go." He motioned to the water below. We go." "Under?" she asked, and he nodded hastily, shifting his eyes between the pretty woman with the blue lips and the monstrous squall with the blue thunder. "Under," he repeated, prompting her to nod in agreement. The idea appeared the most logical, considering their peril. He called out to the other 6, but some ignored him, and others did the same where they were. Still the bleak sun was casting light, as if time stood still here on the island, too early to sleep below the horizon. The clash of the two natural forces made for dangerous beauty. Unintentionally, Haley's gaze recorded the rolling rain of water, as if she was a mere spectator to the tragedy that brewed. When the spray came within her vicinity, the sun illuminated the droplets and edges of water, bathing it in breathtaking prisms of magnificent color. In awe she watched as the colors came tumbling with its movement, like a leviathan kaleidoscope. She almost waited too long for her admiration to make way for necessity. As the thunderous wall imposed on her position, she swiftly sank herself beneath the freezing water, using its volume and depth as refuge. Beneath she waited, her breath tucked in so deep that her chest burned. The bland ocean floor lay spread in vast emptiness, for as far as her burning eyes could afford her sight, in the murk of the inanimate dead blue that embraced her shivering body. She could feel it coming, the sheer force of it magnificent, and she rather expected to expire this day, but hoped for the contrary. Haley listened with deafened ears as the voice of the monster spoke its dire aria through the expanse of sea that hosted it, and her heart pounded with fear more than the rapid loss of oxygen. Against her skin she occasionally felt the caress of her shirt, its sensual lightness stroking the skin of her upper body as she worked her arms to remain under. It moved not with its wearer, but instead obeyed the motion of the current and weighed her down somewhat. For a moment she was oblivious to existence, floating in the womb of the great water and becoming its captive. All was silent, save for the impending sweep of the rage that ran through the surface and its ominous growl. They were nowhere to be seen, those who submerged with her, at least not as far as she could see. Haley ran out of breath quickly and prayed for the merciless onslaught to make done her torment. At once it came upon her, lashing its power onto the water above her head, and she almost lay flat on the sand below now, to distance herself as much from the impact as she could. The crash rocked her, plucking her effortlessly from her position. It seized her away, as if it grabbed her by the ankles and hauled her headlong towards the rocks beneath, where the coal-black fortress divided the two beaches. Haley's bloodshot eyes pinched shut too late as she felt the current fling her helpless body onto the submarine stones. The edges grabbed at her as she rolled aimlessly, remembering to relax in her tumble, and it was then that the horror gripped her. Her last reserve of breath was marked by the fateful seal of her shirt being caught, holding her fast under the water with no hope of surfacing. With all she had left within her, Haley kicked against the wicked rock to liberate herself, but her feet were met with sharp resistance that slipped through the skin of her soles like the blade of a sword. It drew from her ribbons of crimson that decorated the dark blue, in dreamy contrast before marrying the colors of blood and salt. Muffled and mute, her agony drifted through the water, a silent scream that forced from her the last ounce of breath she harbored. Her painful eternity lasted but a moment in reality, while her limp body was drawn through the twirling maelstrom about her. Before she knew it, Haley finally surfaced without any toil. As she was about to lose consciousness, she sucked at the warm air and soon filled her lungs once more. Her eyes were on fire from the salt and the frigid onslaught of the waves, but gradually the obscurity of her view cleared. As she bobbed in the depths of the drop-off she now hanged above, suspended. The beach was in sight, but diminished greatly by distance. The echoes of the fire gatherings in the semi-dusk of the beach sounded like whale calls from another dimension that she could behold, but never reach. Her stalkers had disappeared, save for one. He's that Latino-looking lad from the group of heckling idiots, isn't he? She wondered in the molten madness of her clouded recollection. They all looked much the same to her, similar in features and ethnicity, with raven hair and eyes. Haley was embarrassed to be so ignorant of other cultures, but the truth was that she had never needed to make much contact with the island's folk, and thereby convinced herself that she was merely inept at recognizing facial detail in general. The man looked bewildered. His stunned expression boasted ebony eyes stiffened in their sockets, and his mouth slanted slightly downward in dread. She was now alone in the dark blue waves with an equally petrified stranger that she did not deign to address. They simply crested each wave as it came, and remained in close proximity of one another as an unspoken accordance of safety. From the direction of the main beach emanated a hard splashing and the murmur of low voices. Haley turned to discover the familiar oddity of her previous encounter. There they were, suddenly, the band of inexpressive surfers mounted on their boards. Bone-clawed still, and with determined effort, they made their way slowly towards Haley. For once, not in fear or necessity, she felt the soothing warmth of her urine bleed over the inside of her thighs. Haley's vision blurred and her limbs burned as the gradual exhaustion of paddling began to wear her down. Once more she was caught between two factions of danger. Finally she pulled the heavy, torn shirt from her body and yielded it to the current it so worshipped. She felt naked and vulnerable, not only physically, but for the peril presented that threatened her very soul.
You could actually die here today. Die, Haley. Finals. Do something.
She cast a glance to her silent companion, and her gaze met his wide black eyes as he drifted on the rise and fall a few yards away from her. The man had maintained his blank expression to a fault, as he leered emptily at her, as if he begged for help or instruction without a voice. Haley merely shook her head at him, her attempt at silent conversation. She motioned with her head toward the oncoming group of ivory-bearing aggressors, but he did not so much as look in their direction. No, his eyes remained fixed upon her, with not a notion of breaking his glare. It provoked a most sinister chill in the British executive, who found herself in dark waters of a different kind, an unsettlingly authentic and literal kind. The last light of the dying sun would be her timing device. It was now so weak she could look right into the pallid disk that would soon douse her in darkness. With this she began actively pushing, swimming in spurts of speed, and taking rest in between, as not to exhaust herself before reaching the shallow laps of the water's edge. Haley did not care anymore if they knew. Let them come, the bastards. Let them try. She made good time, and the band of men who had now raised their voices considerably in the heat of the pursuit fell further behind. When she saw this, she could not help but smirk at their imminent defeat at the will of her pasty white tourist ass. But her grin vanished instantly when the swell to her left fell and revealed the mute leer of the silent follower she had failed to leave behind. Her throat dried at the puzzling intentions and uncanny abilities of the drifting young man with the unchanging face. He never moved above water. She noticed that his mouth had grown ever so slightly in its droop, but still his eyes remained fixed. Black and dead, circular irises sank into flat eyeballs that did not seem to move even an inch to the side. They did not dart, they did not steal. His face was a blank canvas for perplexity. And it was then that Haley observed a deeply disquieting trait that she had not noticed in all the time the dark-haired man had floated beside her. He never blinks. Her blood ran to ice. Her heart stopped for a moment and compensated for it by palpitating wildly. Haley knew she had to get away, but he drifted as quickly as she moved. A surreal thought of a waking nightmare, Haley imagined that the stranger was tied to her by some unseen, undetectable cord. What if I make it to the beach and he is attached to me? What if I run out and pull him with? What if he reels me in and I can't find the string? Dread surged through her, and she propelled herself forward toward the beckoning sand that never seemed to come nearer. This is a nightmare. I am dreaming. That's it. I am swimming for my life and not making an inch forward. It's not real. It can't be. But it was. This was the curse of currents, and only the dead rasps of past victims could attest to its malice. In her desperation, Haley turned to the floating face in the waves beside her. In the vast distance she could discern the calls of a fierce band of men, and her voice chimed so loud to her own ears that she found it sobering and real. "I want you to leave me alone," she said in her best broken English, hoping that her simple words would make sense to him. "Keep your voice even. Don't piss him off. Remember, he can swim faster than you." He looked at her, and his mouth twitched so slightly that she doubted if she ever saw it at all. "I want you to leave me alone," she repeated, spitting mouthfuls of bothersome salt water. His face stretched for the first time. From his bowels came a grunt that resembled some form of voice. He exhaled it like a foghorn, a baritone of inhuman sound that placed each word separately. He mimicked the woman's uttering in a sinister error that made her innards scream in brute horror. Haley could not contain the birthing shriek that emanated from her belly, and caught in the mesmerizing glare of the stranger, she was overcome by a sudden wave that took her below in mock mercy. The bellowing men on their longboards rapidly slid through the waves towards the protruding heads of the two swept by the tide. The female had been thrown asunder, and they made haste to assure that the matter would be salvaged before the night came. It was almost dark, and their patrol had to serve until sunset. Any ensuing catastrophe after sundown was none of their concern. Haley elected to utilize her unfortunate submerging to her advantage. "Swim! Hold your breath and swim. Before he notices you don't come up, you'd be on the beach sipping margaritas. Go!" She opened her eyes to find her way in the threatening liquid world, under the deceitful veil of waves and sunshine. Haley guessed at the location of her chaser, and decided to favor a direction away from him. Above the water, she had only seen his face. Before her, in the murk of the sea, she beheld the rest of him. Gulp Gulps of water forced into her throat as she inadvertently gasped at the atrocity she beheld. An ancient leathery skin, much like that of a tortoise, floated before her eyes like an evil drapery of spotted folds. His precise shape obscured to her, his gargantuan body lashed from side to side like the swaying hips of a snake dancer, and like a malevolent net, the mass of him encircled her on all sides, impeding entirely any hope of escape. Haley had no choice but to surface. She had to salvage the breath she relinquished and cry out to the boardmen for aid. Whatever manner of being she was confronted with here, she was not able physically to survive its intention. Her body ached from the cold and exertion, and the sun had just sunk below the deadline of her sundial. "Please, help me," she called out above the roar of the waves as a group of men swiftly approached. Inside her heart she feared the anticipatory caress of the enormous thing that masqueraded as a common man above water. She looked at his face again, her repulsion driving her into hysterical laughter. "You! I know you! I know what you are!" She cackled at the void face looking at her like an innocent child. Her mockery unashamed and brazen, and lost in hope, she shouted, "You are an abomination, you freak!" At last they had braved the currents, the men with the bone claws strapped to their hands, and they wailed at her in unfathomable words of warning. She pointed at the face. "Be careful! He will kill you!" She shrieked at the band of longboarders who surrounded them both. The face moved again, imitating her language with its abhorrent breath. It reeked of rotten wood and putrid flesh, and when the floating tribesmen came above it, the eyes parted. Haley's throat burned under the lash of salt and screamed as the face flattened itself, tucking away what she perceived as a mouth and stretching its brow over the rising bone of its skull. She realized that the face she had looked upon all the while was not the countenance of a man at all. It had simply trailed the girl with gills overhead, their placement perfectly under two black spots, giving it the illusion of a human face. Apparently, the thing's distance, along with her impaired vision in the spray of the waves, provoked her misjudgment all along. The panting woman looked to the beach from where the commotion filled her ears over rushing waves. A cacophony of chanting serenaded sporadic, towering pillars of fire, blazing its orange light against the shimmer of the wet rocks. Carpeting the sands with flowers and adorning one another with neck pieces of bone and teeth, the locals flooded the beaches. With the death of the sun, they cast their eyes upon the darkening ocean in wait. A strong fist grasped Haley's hair and pulled her hard against the bobbing surfboard. She kicked ferociously, annoyed although in her life and death struggle by her bikini crawling up into the crevice of her buttocks. The triviality of it made her laugh, a sad and gentle amusement that escaped her one last time before the captain of the boardmen leaned forward, as they do, and plowed his hand onto the top of her head, penetrating her skull with its ragged protrusions with minimal effort. Haley did not scream. As blood warmed her face, she still wore her smile. The others paddled towards her, ignoring the rubbery gleam of the swaying giant creature in the water surrounding them. One by one they took turns clubbing the female tourist's head with force and bone through bloody tufts of yellow hair, rendering her imminently comatose. From the distant shore the people rejoiced, and their songs reverberated in Haley's dying mind, a jubilee to her wing. Even as her last cognition announced the brush of the rubbery demon against her, she was too tired now. Too tired and too weak to care. The leathery creature, locally called Keelon, opened its toothless beak and found her left calf.
In her excruciating delirium, Haley smiled again as she sank beneath the icy waves. The merry songs of the island people dampened as she descended. She was engulfed by the cold blue silence of oblivion. Her tibia snapped between its smooth, bony jaws, a delightful crack that she was privileged to hear, her final moment. It gnawed until the severed knee separated the lower leg from its host, and down it went, settling itself on the ocean floor like a dozing cat.
Darkness fell over the water. The boardmen watched from afar, now safely on the beach. In silent reverence they stood, waiting for their god to rise. The festival would endure the night, and they hoped that their sacrifice would be sufficient for the fishing season. Over the sea a storm was brewing. It stalked the sky with the stealth of a hunter, but its coming was undeniable to the stern-faced tribesmen. And this is how they celebrate the coming of the harvesting season. Every year I've wanted to come, but I really never got the opportunity. An obnoxious tone pierced the merriment behind them. We were almost late to the party. My assistant is feeling under the weather, apparently. Had the hotel reception give me a note. Couldn't even tell me to my face. Typical. Agatha Spears had her date savagely by the arm. She was now inappropriately dressed in white, revealing her lost war against gravity and age. The poor man she had tricked into accompanying her looked devastated by it all, even for his failed attempts of seeming interested in her tirades. "So, get Mom another drink, would ya?" she ordered him, and the poor man was only too elated for his liberation. He promptly disappeared amongst the people in a frantic flight masquerading as zeal. Agatha recognized the chief as one of the elders and approached him eagerly. "May I impose on you for some cultural enlightenment?" Her shrill voice cut through his ears. The big brown chief looked at her indifferently and chose to ignore her first attempt. Clearly he did not know Agatha Spears and the unrelenting irritation she employed to get her way. "Tell me, Chief, what do you sacrifice during the festival? I read in People magazine that you guys sacrifice people here, just like the Aztecs used to. Is that true?" The middle-aged lush fell about and slurred her words, but the chief could not allow such fallacies to be uttered or believed by outsiders, and he felt compelled to correct her. He turned and took her by the arm, more to keep her upright than to make an impression. "Madam," he started in a surprisingly educated tone, "we do not sacrifice human beings. That is a barbaric rumor, and I am insulted by it." "I am sorry," she tried to compose herself. "Look," he said, and drew her near. "Keep your eye on the waters there." Thunder filled the sky as flashes of lightning pulsed behind molten clouds. Under the water, the feast was slow and delectable. From the beach, the worshippers grew silent. A massive shift in the water ensued, an immense rumble, the feeding frenzy of gods. Agatha gasped as the ocean rose, hissing like a snake as it ascended before her. Perhaps it was the alcohol, perhaps it was the ecstasy of the moment, or the awe of ancient thrall. It stood colossal, a wall of water and foam like a column of salt and leviathan evil, and in its enormous claws it shook the two halves of a torn monster, feasting on its blotted cadaver. The broken creature was limp and rapidly moving mountain of water the only evidence of its departure. Sobered instantly by what she had just beheld, Agatha stood confounded, astonished. "See? We don't sacrifice humans. We sacrifice Kilons, madame," the chief said, and with that he walked away into the blazing festivities. Agatha clawed at her clothing and ground her teeth in disbelief with a small, insignificant wish. "My God, I wish Haley could have seen that,"